This is game 5 of this epic match between Alireza Firouzja and Vasyl Ivanchuk, and this is hands down the best game of the match so far. So Alireza got off to a flyer, he was 3-0 ahead. Vasyl came back, he won the last one. Can he continue that streak in this game? He's got the white pieces. Full details of this match are below. We're now into the blitz section. They've done the 4 rapid games. So here Vasyl kicks off with pawn to e4. We had e5 in response. We went down this Spanish main line like we saw in their other games. And after bishop a4, Alireza goes pawn to d6. This is a sideline. Normally you see knight f6 there. We had castles from Vasyl, bishop to d7, and now rook to e1 was played once again, so not c3 or pawn d4 immediately. And when you go rook e1, now this allows this g5 move, which Alireza plays for the second time. Really aggressive stuff, really exciting. And once again, Ivanchuk responds in the absolute best way. He counters the flank attack by playing in the centre. So pawn d4 on the board. g4 was played, kicking on. You can't move this knight, otherwise you lose the d4 pawn. So d5 is forced. Now this knight came back to e7, and here the bishops got exchanged, the queen recaptured, and now Ivanchuk goes knight d2 like he did in the third game. Best here is actually knight to h4, because now if you go pawn f5, you're clamping on that square, plus the queen holds the d5 pawn here. What we'll see in the game is that after queen to d7, knight d2, f5 is a really powerful response. So in the third game, Alireza went pawn to h5, and it's not as incisive as this pawn f5 move. So the capture occurred here, that's forced, you can't let black go pawn f4, you're just getting killed on the king side, but now you don't recapture on f5, here black takes on d5. So the queen now took on g4, white does pick up that pawn, but Alireza now gets the castle queenside, and this whole variation is just infinitely better than the position he got in game 3. And now the queen nudged back to f3 here, prophylaxis against h5, it hits the knight on d5, and that was now defended with knight to f6. And now the best here for Vasyl would have been to go knight to f1, for the reason being, this pawn's actually quite weak, and you want to sit this knight on g3, defend the pawn. If black ever goes h5 to kick your knight with h4, then you meet it with pawn h4 yourself. This is the correct way to play. But Vasyl goes knight a3 here, so he's looking to bring it into c4, but it now allows Alireza to go this knight e7 move, and they're always tricky to spot, these retreating knight moves, but this pawn actually can't be defended now. You don't want to go g4, of course, that's horrendous, ripping open your own king, so white has to ignore it and just go knight to b3, continue some development. And now you can immediately capture that pawn, but Alireza instead goes rook to g8, he prefers to develop for the moment. Excellent move. The rook came to d1 here, so Ivanchuk's looking for some play down the d file, trying to use some pins, and now pawn to e4 was played by Alireza. Once again, he ignores that f5 pawn, he wants to play for initiative, this is blitz chess. The queen ducked away to h3 here, and now the best move in the position is actually just taking that pawn with the queen. Yes, it goes into an endgame without the queens, but black is a clean pawn up, doing really well. But instead of going for this is so typical of Alireza's style, he doesn't take that pawn, he wants to keep the queens on an attack, so he plays this really interesting rook to g4 move. Such a fascinating move because it kind of boxes in this black queen, white queen rather, it's completely trapped off here. The bishop now can't come to f4, so Alireza's just trying to squash Ivanchuk here. But it's not the best move because now knight c4 comes and there's a problem. This pawn is pinned by the rook here, and so the knight's coming into e5, forking these two pieces. How does Alireza respond? Well, he just ignores it. He goes knight takes on f5, going after his own plans, leaving white to do this, because actually he's got something stunning planned here. Of course you can now guess what he played. He just sacks his queen, he takes the knight on e5. Such an exceptional player, the way he sees the board. So the rook took the queen here, of course. What else? The rook recaptured. So bishop e3 played, opening up the defense of the back rank. Alireza goes pawn h5. We had king to f1. Chucky wants to step off this rook line. The rook now came to f7, and so Alireza wants to line this one up against the king. And also after white goes rook d1, seizing the file, his plan here is to block it with bishop d6, just try and block out those white pieces. But bishop to c5 comes from Ivanchuk, and Alireza is now really low on time, around 10 seconds or so he chucks a pawn here to really try and mix up the position. So he plays pawn e3, and this isn't the best move. He's trying to open up the e4 square, but white should just take this pawn and stay pretty solid, doing well. But Ivanchuk doesn't do that. He gets a bit spooked. He goes pawn f3. He wants to keep the lines closed, cover the e4 square, and he hits this rook. Now the rook moves away here, comes to f4. Moving it to that square is forced because the queen is attacking the knight. It would take with check, so you have to hold the knight. And it begs the question, well, what would happen if we now attack this rook? Now you can't go g3 or black takes here. This is really good for black. But what you can do is what Chucky played, take that pawn on e3 with the bishop. How is black wiggling out of this one? Well, can you find the only move in the position to keep the game alive for black? And if you're enjoying this video, do consider subscribing to never miss another in the series. So here Alireza played the awesome move, knight to d5. So there's a couple captures going on here. In the game, the knight was taken on d5. If you capture the rook on f4, then the knight recaptures and the queen is actually checkmated by those knights. You can't save it. Black is completely winning. So Chucky takes on d5. And now here's the follow-up, rook to h4. Alireza finally checkmates that white queen. He's winning it by force. So the rook was captured. The knight took back. And when we look at the material now, it's actually been restored on the minor and major pieces, but black is actually a pawn down here. So white's doing really well, has got the pressure. Knight d2 played. This one came back to f5, hits the bishop. It dropped back into f2 here. Knight e7 now hit the rook. It dropped back to d3 and the knight remaneuvered round to g6. It defends this pawn, also looks at the f4 square. So Chucky now gets on with his plans. He goes knight to e4. Look at that beautiful knight, rock solid in the centre, and Alireza only has about 5 seconds left. He's really under the cosh now. Ivanchuk has about 50 seconds. So we had bishop to e7, protecting that one. He didn't want it to be taken twice. Now bishop to e3 played, and after knight to h4, a kind of pseudo-aggressive move, it has to come back after rook d5, hitting the pawn. The knight defends it once again. And now Chucky can just get his queenside pawns going, and there's very little that Alireza can do. So h4 came from Alireza, king e2, the rook came to f5, and now we had pawn c3, and Alireza just starts shuffling here, going for this passive defense. It's very difficult for him to actually do anything. So rook h5 played, b4 on the board, rook f5, b5, captures here like this. The pawn came to b6 clamping, c4 played, rook h5, and now here I think Ivanchuk should have played some stuff on the king side. Maybe started improving this bishop slightly, or go g4 immediately. We saw this kind of thing in the game, but after a pair of minor pieces had been swapped off, I think if he'd gone for something like this with both minor pieces on the board, he could have pressed a bit better. But he still has a lot of press after what he plays in the game, which is pawn c5. So Alireza captures. That one was taken back, and now Alireza chops off that dangerous knight. The rook recaptured, and I would argue that the black defensive task is just slightly easier now without that knight hopping around the board. So the king came to d7, king d3 played, and now knight h8 was a beautiful remaneuver from Alireza. So he's looking to come to f7, where he then holds the pawn and can come to d6 in the future. g4 now from Chucky. We had captures en passant, recaptures here, knight f7, pawn g4 hit the rook, And now after rook h3, both players are under 10 seconds. It's getting very tense on the clock. Alireza keeps winning these time scrambles. What will happen in this one? So king e2 defends. The rook checked from h2 now, and if you come back here, we could see a repeat of the position. Chucky doesn't want that. He wants to keep pressing. So he goes king f1, and now Alireza should leave the rook where it is, play something like king to d6, for the reason being this g-pawn is coming really fast down the board here, and once it kicks the knight, you need this pawn to be defended. But what Alireza does is swing this rook over here. Yes, he pressures the b pawn, but now this one's coming, g5, really fast. Black's in some trouble, and it's now really hard for Alireza. So he goes rook to b3, hitting this bishop, and here actually Ivanchuk had an amazing resource. He could have gone immediately pawn to g6. Now if black takes here, which is forced, if you move the knight, the pawn was just going through, then here's the trick. White doesn't immediately take, then there's this check and you pick up the pawn, but you go king f2, kick that rook away, then take here, and no matter whether black goes king e7 or rook a8, let's say we do that one, white just has a superb endgame after something like this, completely winning. So that was a winning shot, but after rook to b3, g6 wasn't played, instead Ivanchuk defended that bishop, and now it gives Alireza just a moment's check again. King g3 played. This still looks really scary for black. We had king to e6 now, so here Alireza abandons this pawn. It was taken, but he picks up this one in return. Now the rook checked from c6, and now the knee-jerk reaction is king f5, come towards the pawn, but don't do that. Now you're running into rook f6 checkmate. So we didn't have that one. The king came to d5. The rook came back to a6 now. Knight d6, we can see Alireza's just coordinating his pieces. This is really tough for white to win, but what can Chucky do? So king g4 played, rook b4 check, but now king h5, look at that king march. This pawn is so dangerous. How's Alireza going to stop that one? So rook b3 played, hits the bishop, and now Chucky ignores that one, goes pawn to g6. He's correctly seen that you can't take or this one's going through. So instead of takes, Alireza dropped his knight back, and now here Chucky makes this move with literally a second, even half a second on the clock. It looked like it had gone to 0. He goes bishop g5, just makes it, gets his extra 3 seconds. So the rook captured here, rook a8 played, hits the knight, but it comes to g7 with check. Now the king dropped back here. If you keep coming down here, well, the knight can check here, say king h7, rook h3, king g8. You can swing back here. There are different motifs to start making a draw. So we didn't have that one. Instead, the king came to g4 here. The rook dropped back to f1, and now Chucky starts checking. And by this point, he realized he didn't have more than the draw. He's lost that extra pawn at this point. What else can he actually do but just make the draw? So he checks here, the king comes to d5, and now bishop f6. He gives this pawn on g6, but he's now taking this one back. Although he walks into a self-pin, you can go bishop to c3 here, or you can do as Chucky did, check from a4. Yes, you give a piece, but now you check here. After the king moves, we take here, and that's insufficient mating material. The game was drawn. What an exciting encounter. If you want to see the full playlist, see below, and subscribe to the channel, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.